share some of my thoughts. I want to also say that, I don't have all the answers, but I've been here for almost 4 years. My term of duty ends in December 15th. And I need to thank the University of Berzay for having given me numerous of opportunities of not sharing my thoughts, but also learning from Palestinians, academics, students, activists, politicians, although I see very few politicians now here, but nonetheless, it's a unique experience, and I think I leave being much enriched from this experience that I've had in Palestine over the last 4 years. Colleagues, I saw Dr. Ghassan Khatib here, I see Jamal, Yaqub somewhere there, and there were a group of people amongst the various political factions. First time in the history of Palestinians we had invited in 2016 all the political factions, people from West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, from Ash-Shatat, from Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and of course some of them also in Turkey now, to come to South Africa. And yes, there were people also from Aradi Tamani Warbain, people from the 48 areas. And over a period of 5 days, we shared the experiences. And I thought it would be good to begin my presentation to talk about what they had identified as issues that I think is very important to the topic that we have. I mean, the democratization of Palestinian politics as a basis for rebuilding the national project. The points that they had come out with, and I think which was evidently clear also in the previous session, the mass mobilization as a means to end occupation. I think that is a fundamental issue that needs to be talked about. Focusing on ending settlement activity, highlighting the issue of Jerusalem and the right of return of Palestinian refugees. I may add also, a fundamental issue with us was to add that the release of political prisoners. This is almost an issue that is, in the last 4 years, I'm happy that Khalida Jarrah is also here. She's probably outside, because one of the first things that we did, even as a mission here, was to highlight her issues. Every time she was, it's because that, President Mandela had said, when the apartheid government were trying to engage him, he said, in prison, while he was in prison, he said, people in chains are not in a position to negotiate their freedom. And you know that there are many of your political leaders, people, because when you talk about democratization, I think all those political prisoners, that is exactly what they want for themselves and for you to attain. And of course, developing a new vision and a practical narrative on Palestine that is all-inclusive. And the last point that I think, which is very important, is ensuring that youth and women are an integral part of the Palestinian collective. Now, I will focus my topic today. Well, you have this in mind. Within that context, a very important component of the South African society, or the majority of South Africans, and this is the working class. And you say, you will agree with me, there is a growing body of literature on the role and impact of unions in the developing world, and on their ability to mobilize members against a background of new liberal reforms. Some of you may be thinking, why would a diplomat speak about this? Because we are in a different world, a unipolar world, and it's almost, we're talking about neoliberalism as a diplomat, it may be problematic, but I will take that risk. Fortunately, I have a government that allows me that space, even to criticize it for what is happening, and probably you will, it will be interesting to see your response to what I'm going to now say. The South African trade union movement represents a source of inspiration to organize labor worldwide, but has faced many challenges over the years. trade unions have always been an extremely powerful force in South African politics and society. The South African trade union movement is arguably the strongest in the African continent due to its role in the ending of apartheid and its continued growth in adverse circumstances. The first trade unions were established by immigrant craft workers who bargained on the basis of skill and then racial exclusivism. Since the early days of apartheid, many of these unions formed an alliance with liberation movements and community organizations to address issues that affected their members beyond the workplace. 7 unions, collectively known as the Magnificent Seven, were instrumental in the foundation of the United Democratic Front in 1983. Just to go back a little bit, before, in 1993, or in 1962, the African National Congress and political parties were banned. Maybe I should have also said the release of the unbanning of political organization in my initial statement. And these Magnificent Seven, they formed the United Democratic Front, basically being the mass democratic movement within the country while our political leaders were in prison or in exile, which protested apartheid by means of rent boycotts, mass protests, and school and work stayaways, with their clear enemy being the apartheid state and the tactics of the movements being determined by the strategy of ungovernability. It may be a serious thing to talk about it here. But either way, I'm talking about the South African experience, and I'm not dictating what you should do here. But there are lessons in what we did in South Africa. In South Africa, the relationship between trade unions and political parties can be traced back to the early days of the South African Congress of Trade Unions, called SACTU, which was formed in 1955 and formed an alliance with the African National Congress. Today, reference can be made to the alliance that exists between COSATU, the Congress of South African Trade Union, the African National Congress, and the South African Communist Party. Among COSATU's founding resolutions were overtly political goals, such as to call for the lifting of the state of emergency, withdrawal of troops from the townships, and the release of all political prisoners, and to continue the call for international pressure against apartheid South Africa, including disinvestment. I know the last time I was here in Berzade, I shared a platform with the BDS movement. South African trade unions played a very important role to dismantle apartheid. It is hard to understand the impact of the unions in the liberation of South Africa and their contribution to the establishment of a new democratic government of South Africa in 1994. When the time came to negotiate a new constitution for the country, the unions were not ignored. The Bill of Rights grants workers the right to form and join a trade union, the right to strike, the right to collective bargaining, and these rights were to be recognized in national legislation. Unions have a voice in the National Economic Development and Labour Council, which we have in South Africa, that is government, the labor unions, and organized business, called NADLAC, which was formed in 1995 as a statutory body that brings government, business, and labor unions together to find consensus on economic, labor, developmental policies, and legislation. To this day, unions direct their millions of members to vote as a bloc, giving them a commanding voice in the country's politics. Clearly, for all the good they did helping liberate South Africa, however, since 1994, a series of questions that relate to their role in democratic South Africa have remained unanswered. While the end of apartheid brought with it possibilities and promises of a better life for all, for a united and strong civil society mobilized against the apartheid state, the reality of the transition in South Africa has been a neoliberal one, representing several dangers for its citizens. The greatest of these dangers has been an attack on those resources and products that came to be seen as common to all South Africans, such as water, as all that is common is made commodity, and humanity itself is subdivided, packaged and sold off to the highest bidder. Again, coming back to neoliberal policy that is entrenched in our constitution. Now, this is the issue that probably you may look at, because I think the previous discussion, I haven't been here, spoke about the role of the various institutions and the Naqabat. So I'm saying, let's look at what happened in South Africa, the decline of the South African unions. COSATU's rapid expansion in the private sector in the 1980s, its actually rapid expansion in the public sector in the 1990s, and its role in the destruction of apartheid all represent major success stories. To critics, this has tended to obscure the real challenges and compromises that threaten the labor movement. The opening up of global markets, following the end of apartheid, and the reduction of protective tariffs have had both beneficial and adverse effects. On the one hand, South Africa has repositioned itself as an export-oriented economy and is globally competitive in areas such as motor vehicle and component manufacture, steel, processed foods, and niche textiles. On the other hand, this competitiveness has been attained through a shift to leaner manufacturing and wholesale job shedding. The ability to sustain membership levels has been further threatened by the apparent inability to organize informal workers, which in many developing countries is now the way of life for many. In the formal sector, apparently, high levels of social solidarity can mask internal divisions and power inequalities, with evidence of a growing gap between leaders and ordinary members, and leaders moving into lucrative career positions in government or the private sector. Moreover, a culture of majoritarianism, whereby after vigorous debate, decisions becoming binding on all with little tolerance for further dissent, may be useful when facing state repression, but can, over the long term, prove organizationally debilitating. The changing role of trade unions after 1994, and that's where the crux is. What are the challenges? ما هي التحديات يواجه الحركة العمال هذه الأيام? With the unbanning of political parties, the release of political prisoners, including Nelson Mandela, the return of exiled leadership of the African National Congress, and the entry into negotiations with the apartheid government by the ANC with an international context of neoliberal restructuring, enormous challenges were placed on these organs of people power to redirect their focus from contesting state power and moving towards the building of a democratic state. For activists interviewed, and I'd like to think that we are all activists in our own way, this manifested itself in various recognizable shifts in the liberation movement from the 1990s onwards, especially after 1994. Therefore, all vibrant structures that had been built in the 1980s, women's, youth, and other structures of the mass democratic movement were swallowed up under the rubric of the exiled African National Congress. And I say this very clearly as a card-carrying member of the African National Congress. The last time I saw, I mean, my membership is still strong. This process of demobilization started in the early 1990s as a political strategy of the African National Congress to take away any possibility of independent working class movement outside its own framework, so as to politically control everyone and bring them under its own umbrella. Maybe I'm also a victim of that, maybe, because I'm living the life of a diplomat. And those of us that know the lives of a diplomat, you live the life. Huh? You know, people open your doors, they call you excellencies. It's nice. You forget where you come from. But anyway, that's a topic for another day. In addition, many leaders of the movement were given positions in government, me included. By the time of the 1994 election, the scene has been set for the institutionalization of the power of bureaucracy, particularly of the exiled ANC structures and the demobilization of the grassroots that had brought the ANC this far. With the demise of apartheid, trade unions have found themselves having to deal with new kinds of issues and challenges. In the past, the struggle was to fight against oppression in the workplace and in society. However, since 1994, trade unions are operating in a democracy, and trade union organizations such as COSATU are in alliance with the ruling party, the African National Congress. The alliance provided COSATU with a platform to influence key policies of the new government after 1994. In this regard, several COSATU and South African Communist Party members joined the government as members of parliament, others as senior government officials. This provided these organizations with a voice in the government. Even today, trade unions have a strong influence on policy and legislative proposals through their participation at NADLAC, which I had initially commented on. Since the demise of apartheid, organizations such as COSATU have focused their energies to transform the South African society and its institutions. South African society continues to be characterized by inequalities which manifest themselves in different forms. These include inequality of income, inequality of economic power, and inequality of access to basic services such as health care, water, education, and so on. In the short, the new struggle for trade unions is to overcome the legacy of apartheid. It is on the basis of this challenge that unions have been compelled to develop new strategies and policies. It should be noted, though, that during the apartheid era, many of these unions had adopted a militant stance against apartheid state and employers. They refused to take part in any statutory structures or schemes initiated by the state and employers. There was this fear that participation may cause unions to end up being co-opted into capitalist and apartheid structures. A change of attitude began to occur in the trade union movement around the 1990s. When it started to engage the apartheid state and business at macro level in forums such as the National Manpower Commission and the National Economic Forum. Other forms of engagement also took place at that time, in particular industrial sectors. These included the Mining Industry Summit and the Textile Clothing Working Group. Unions feared that they did not participate. If they did not participate, they would be unable to influence the way the change was being implemented in various sectors of the economy. Different interpretations have been given to describe this change of strategy by unions. Some labor analysts talk of a shift from resistance to reconstruction, while others refer to a shift from social unionism to strategic unionism. Trade union political party nexus. The strength of any trade union lies in its capacity to advance and protect the interests of all its members. These interests can be affected positively or negatively by the factors beyond the shop floor. Politics is one big factor. Politics affects the social and economic lives of people on a daily basis. I think you know that better than anyone else. One does not need to be a political party hack to be affected by its politics. Politics determines taxes, it affects the price of bread, it determines access to health care or education, and affects the fortunes of a whole nation. I don't think Palestinians need any lessons in this. In fact, they can give lessons on that. Thomas Mann, the German novelist, was indeed correct when he asserted there is nothing that is not political. Everything is politics. Political parties, pressure groups, and individuals seek to influence policy in their favor. Unions, too, wish to have the power to determine allocation of resources to their advantage. It also economically beneficial for a political party to have the support of trade unions. Trade unions are self-sustainable organizations with capacity for fundraising, the subscription fees, and pension schemes that they have. I was speaking to, well, we were just having a short discussion before we came here with Professor Mudar Kassis and talking about the lawyers' organization and the subscription and membership that is exorbitantly high. They own, and they contribute to political parties. They are cash cows for political parties, waiting to be milked. In some countries, political parties took to trade unions for funding for their political campaigns. It should not come to a surprise, therefore, when political parties battle to capture and control trade unions. The relationship between unions and political parties is a two-way affair. It is a relationship driven by the mutual desire to influence each other. From this relationship, unions have to achieve one thing. They have to be labor-friendly. Outcomes in government and the economy. On their part, political parties expect many things: assurances of economic stability, electoral support, as well as financial benefits, as I just mentioned. The deployment of union leaders in government and outside of the union. The general justification is that unions involve themselves in party politics in order to influence policy formulation in government. Thus, political parties can be viewed as a means through which unions attain their funds or attain their ends. All unions wish to influence institutions that regulate labor relations and to determine the price of labor. They would prefer the election into office of public office bearers who believe in their cause. In order to gain this influence, unions neither enter into alliances with political parties or deploy their representatives to serve in the leadership structures of political parties, especially governing parties. In some countries, unions engage actively in the formation of pro-labor parties to contest political power. While in many countries union leaders have earned political clout, many have been unable to turn political clout into fortunes for union members. Proximity to political parties has not yielded labor-friendly outcome. Some union leaders use their access to political power to pursue selfish interests. In South Africa, not only the unions were affected by the African National Conference policy of cadre deployment. Immediately after 1994 elections, many COSATU unionists were deployed into government, municipalities, and state-owned enterprises. While this policy ensures that deployees are able to influence and implement ANC policy, it had a negative effect on the capacity of the union to carry out its function. What will happen? After 1994, academics also, unionists, we had what was called the South African National Civic Organization. Their leadership went into government, and they thought that government will deliver. Even civil society sat back, hoping that government would deliver. And that was the biggest mistake, because it is these organs of civil society that are part of the democracy that ensures that you move forward. Now, I could go on, but let me just pick up a few points on the challenges that trade unions in post-apartheid South Africa face. A number of problems within the trade unions which have begun to emerge, especially after 1994. Amongst these is the decline of worker involvement in union affairs, demobilization of union members, lack of organizational capacity, a lack of a clear vision of changing society, and the fact that most unionists are now being driven by individualism and a quest for upward mobility. The failure of the union leaders to deal with such problems had led many of their members to join rival unions. Almost all labor movements in South Africa have adopted socialism or Marxism as its official ideology that guides the union in its day-to-day activities and struggle. Socialism, well, in the mantra of the movement, socialism is our future. It is through socialism that workers can achieve total liberation. It is an ideology based on the writings of Karl Marx, which advocates the transformation of the capitalist economic system. I know some of us will feel, hey, what are you talking about capitalism today? But I think it is still necessary. There was Joe Slovo, one of the persons that I spoke about that came to our conference on the Palestinian Dialogue Forum is here. Comrade Ida Suliman, so it's good to see that she is here with us today. She was also the part of the Palestinian collective that was looking at the future that could benefit from the South African experience. But coming back to Joe Slovo, a leader of the Communist Party, a member of the Central Committee of the African National Congress. I'm using Central Committee, we call it the National Executive Committee, our first Minister of Housing. In 1988, well before we went into negotiation, he wrote a beautiful article, if you can get it. Has socialism failed, or have we failed socialism? It's something that you need you can Google it, hopefully you'll pick it up. But it is something that I read in my early days. I was still a student then. It is a system characterized by a conflict of interests between two major social classes in society, namely the capitalists and the working class. Therefore, it is not surprising that trade unions in South Africa would align themselves with the socialist ideology, since it advocates a radical change of society. Well, I'm not going to talk about what it is there, but I think for me what is very important is to see what needs, how do we relate this to where we find ourselves today within lessons for Palestine. And coming back to that conference that we held, the participants resolved to identify points of agreement, and I think which is necessary for us here today. And we need to develop these points as opposed to debilitating on differences. Basically, I'm supposed to be speaking on international solidarity. Palestinians need to convince the international community that it is not, that Palestinians are not terrorists. Because this is this is what goes out there. And to provide a foundation for a democracy. Now, this is very important, because we have in our notion of democracy very limited. We just think of it within the Oslo process. But I think, coming back to the conference theme, one person, one vote, and a protection. Now, we knew what we were dealing with in our country. The minority, the Boers, the Afrikaners, they wanted their rights. So to include minority rights within the Bill of Rights, which is part of our Constitution. The Bill of Rights was created to protect the people from politicians. Not only about the minority, but also from politicians and any potential abuse of power and money that may occur in future. 6 years of negotiation and the process of negotiation had to be invented as the negotiations developed sufficient consensus and was targeted to process. The institution building process was equally important as the new constitution, which had to be developed by the Constituent Assembly. A constitutional court to assess the final product of the constitution and the independence of the public protector. Colleagues, I could really speak at length, but I don't want to labor you, and maybe we can have that in discussion. But what I thought I would like to do is, national reconciliation and the unity must take precedence over all other considerations. The collective leadership of the Palestinians should attend international conferences and speak thereof in one voice, especially on agreed positions, and avoid points of departure. When you'll get them here and you'll get various, I know in a democracy you can have that, but don't take your democracy too far into the international community. Leave that part of your engagement for forums like this. On the issue of ending occupation, the liberation movement leads the program. Jerusalem is the capital of the Palestinian state. There is no Palestine without Gaza and Jerusalem. And also, it is something that colleagues agreed there, and Ida is witness to that, agreed on the principle of no work, no pay, that was with regards to Gaza. Participants disagreed on the question of recognizing the state of Israel and on armed resistance. A way forward is to have an interim leadership arrangement that will be trusted to coordinate a new dispensation. Colleagues, I'm not going to talk about elections because I don't know whether it is just an election mantra, but it is for you to really talk about it. National unity will be supported by the international community. A political and economic program be drawn within the framework of national unity. And a new government based on inclusive representation. There is a need for a new political dispensation. There has to be an agreement on how to liberate Palestine. And democracy is essential for a future Palestinian discourse. Thank you.